Hello and welcome to section 1.2 of chapter 1. In this section, I'm going to go over the process of science as it is written in the Concept of Biology book from OpenStax. Okay, by the end of this section, you will be able to identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences, understand the process of scientific inquiry, compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning, describe the goals of basic science and applied science. There it is. Like geology, physics, and chemistry, biology is a science that gathers knowledge about the natural world. Specifically, biology is the study of life. The discoveries of biology are made by a community of researchers who work individually and together using agreed-on methods. In this sense, biology, like all sciences, is a social enterprise like politics or the arts. The methods of science include careful observation, record-keeping, logical and mathematical reasoning, experimentation, and submitting conclusions to the scrutiny of others. Science also requires considerable imagination and creativity. A well-designed experiment is commonly described as elegant or beautiful, or it can be a big solid mess. Like politics, science has considerable practical implications, and some science is dedicated to practical applications, such as the prevention of disease. Oh wait, let me show you this figure here. Yay! Other science proceeds largely motivated by curiosity. Whatever its goal, there is no doubt that science, including biology, has transformed human existence and will continue to do so. The nature of science. Biology is a science, but what exactly is science? What does the study of biology share with other scientific disciplines? Science, from the Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, can be defined as knowledge about the natural world. Science is a very specific way of learning or knowing about the world. The history of the past 500 years demonstrates that science is a very powerful way of knowing about the world. It is largely responsible for the technological revolutions that have taken place during this time. There are, however, areas of knowledge and human experience that the methods of science cannot be applied to. These include such things as answering purely moral questions, aesthetic questions, or what can be generally characterized as spiritual questions. I guess we're being nice about the word religious in here. Science cannot investigate these areas because they are outside the realm of material phenomena, the phenomena of matter and energy, and cannot be observed and measured. Reinforcing that, we go here. We cannot answer any of these questions. Anything that we are going to attempt to answer has to be something that can be tested, can be observed, can be measured. Okay. The scientific method is a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. These steps of the scientific method will be examined in detail later, but one of the most important aspects of this method is the testing of hypotheses. A hypothesis is a suggested explanation for an event which can be tested. Hypotheses, or tentative explanations, are generally produced within the context of a scientific theory. A scientific theory is a generally accepted, thoroughly tested, and confirmed explanation for a set of observations or phenomena. Scientific theory is the foundation of scientific knowledge. In addition, in many scientific disciplines, less so in biology, there are scientific laws, often expressed in mathematical formulas, which describe how elements of nature will behave under certain specific conditions. There is not an evolution of hypotheses through theories to laws as if they represented some increase in certainty about the world. Hypotheses are the day-to-day material that scientists work with and they are developed within the context of theories. Laws are concise descriptions of parts of the world that are amenable to formulaic or mathematical description. I gotta roll back for this one. Natural sciences for this picture. What would you expect to see in a museum of natural sciences? Hopefully most of you have already seen things in a museum of natural sciences. If not, get thee to a museum. Anyway, frogs, plants, dinosaur skeletons. Exhibits about how the brain functions. Planetarium, gems and minerals, maybe all of the above. Science includes such diverse fields as astronomy, biology, computer science, geology, logic, physics, chemistry, and mathematics. However, those fields of science related to the physical world and its phenomena and processes are considered natural sciences. Thus, a museum of natural science might contain any of the items listed above. Maybe you could have told by my expression, there is no complete agreement when it comes to defining what the natural sciences include. For some experts, the natural sciences are astronomy, biology, chemistry, earth science, and physics. Other scholars choose to divide the natural sciences into life sciences, which study living things and include biology, and physical sciences, which study non-living matter and includes astronomy, physics, and chemistry. Some disciplines such as biophysics and biochemistry build on two sciences and are interdisciplinary. Scientific inquiry. One thing is common to all forms of science. The ultimate goal, to know. Or to know for right now, anyway. Curiosity and inquiry are the driving forces for the development of science. Scientists seek to understand the world and the way it operates. Two methods of logical thinking are used, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion. This type of reasoning is common in descriptive science. A life scientist, such as a biologist, makes observations and records them. These data can be qualitative, descriptive, or quantitative, consisting of numbers, and the raw data can be supplemented with drawings, pictures, photos, or videos. For many observations, the scientist can infer conclusions, inductions, based on evidence. Inductive reasoning involves formulating generalizations inferred from careful observations and the analysis of a large amount of data. Brain studies often work this way. Many brains are observed while people are doing a task, with a method like functional MRI. The part of the brain that lights up, indicating activity, is then demonstrated to be the part controlling the response to that task. Deductive reasoning, or deduction, is the type of logic used in hypothesis-based science. In deductive reasoning, the pattern of thinking moves in the opposite direction as compared to inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses a general principle or law to forecast specific results. From those general principles, a scientist can extrapolate and predict the specific results that would be valid as long as the general principles are valid. For example, a prediction would be that if the climate is becoming warmer in a region, the distribution of plants and animals should change. Comparisons have been made between distributions in the past and the present, and the many changes that have been found are consistent with a warming climate. Finding the change in distribution is evidence that the climate change conclusion is a valid one. Both types of logical thinking are related to the two main pathways of scientific study: descriptive science and hypothesis-based science. Descriptive, or discovery, science aims to observe, explore, and discover, while hypothesis-based science begins with a specific question or problem and a potential answer or solution that can be tested. The boundary between these two forms of study is often blurred, because most scientific endeavors combine both approaches. Observations lead to questions, questions lead to forming a hypothesis as a possible answer to those questions, and then the hypothesis is tested. Thus, descriptive science and hypothesis-based science are in continuous dialogue. Hypothesis testing. Biologists study the living world by posing questions about it and seeking science-based responses. This approach is common to other sciences as well and is often referred to as the scientific method. The scientific method was used even in ancient times, well, a lot less formally, but it was first documented by England's Sir Francis Bacon, who lived from 1561 to 1626. There's his picture, who set up inductive methods for scientific inquiry. In his book Novum Organum, most famously, the scientific method is not exclusively used by biologists, but can be applied to almost anything as a logical problem-solving method. The scientific process typically starts with an observation, often a problem to be solved, that leads to a question. Let's think about a simple problem that starts with an observation and apply the scientific method to solve the problem. One Monday morning, a student arrives at class and quickly discovers that the classroom is too warm. That is an observation that also describes a problem. The classroom is too warm. My office is too warm. Yeah, I can't answer that as easily as this example here. The student then asks a question. Why is the classroom so warm? Recall that a hypothesis is a suggested explanation that can be tested. To solve the problem, several hypotheses may be proposed. For example, one hypothesis might be, the classroom is warm because no one turned on the air conditioning. But there could be other responses to the question, and therefore other hypotheses may be proposed. A second hypothesis might be, the classroom is warm because there is a power failure, and so the air conditioning doesn't work. Once a hypothesis has been selected, a prediction may be made. A prediction is similar to a hypothesis, but it typically has the format, if, then. If blank, then blank. For example, a prediction for the first hypothesis might be, if the student turns on the air conditioning, then the classroom will no longer be too warm. A hypothesis must be testable to ensure that it is valid. For example, a hypothesis that depends on what a bear thinks is not testable, because it can never be known what a bear thinks. It should also be falsifiable, meaning that it can be disproven by experimental results. An example of an unfalsifiable hypothesis is Botticelli's Birth of Venus is Beautiful. There is no experiment that might show this statement to be false. To test a hypothesis, a researcher will conduct one or more experiments designed to eliminate one or more of the hypotheses. This is important. A hypothesis can be disproven or eliminated, but it can never be proven. Science does not deal in proofs like mathematics. If an experiment fails to disprove a hypothesis, then we find support for that explanation. But this is not to say that down the road a better explanation will not be found, or that a more carefully designed experiment will be found to falsify the hypothesis. So we talk in a language of supporting a hypothesis, evidence for a hypothesis, rather than proof. Sometimes we slip, we're human, but even when we use proof in the concept of speaking about science, we are talking about support and evidence for, to accept a hypothesis based on the evidence. Each experiment will have one or more variables and one or more controls. A variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during the experiment. A control is a part of the experiment that does not change. Look for the variables and controls in the example that follows. As a simple experiment, an experiment might be conducted to test the hypothesis that phosphate limits the growth of algae in freshwater ponds. A series of artificial ponds are filled with water, and half of them are treated by adding phosphate each week, while the other half are treated by adding a salt that is known not to be used by algae. The variable here is the phosphate, or lack of phosphate. The experimental or treatment cases are the ponds with added phosphate, and the control ponds are those with something inert added, such as the salt. Just adding something is also a control against the possibility that adding extra matter to the pond has an effect. So it's a blank instead of doing nothing. And in this example, it's such as the salt is the something inert. If the treated ponds show lesser growth of algae, then we have found support for our hypothesis. If they do not, then we reject our hypothesis. Be aware that rejecting one hypothesis does not determine whether or not the other hypotheses can be accepted. It simply eliminates one hypothesis that is not valid. And that's very important. Demonstrating one hypothesis is false or is wrong or can't be supported is not evidence for an alternative explanation in and of itself. You see that often out in the world. People want to say, since this is wrong, then this other option must be correct. And that's at least not in science. Okay. Using the scientific method, hypotheses that are inconsistent with experimental data are rejected. So the scientific method is a series of defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. If a hypothesis is not supported by data, a new hypothesis can be proposed. In the example below, the scientific method is used to solve an everyday problem. Which part in the example below is the hypothesis, which is the prediction? Based on the results of the experiment, is the hypothesis supported? If it is not supported, propose some alternative hypotheses. Here is the experiment, and here is the example. Here's the example right here. Now, the way this is done, it's already in order, so I'm not going to hold you in suspense. So the observation is, my toaster doesn't toast the bread. So you may ask yourself, where is that large automobile? I mean, why doesn't my toaster work? So then, following that, maybe there's something wrong with the electrical outlet. That's a hypothesis. And then you make a prediction if something is wrong. My coffee maker also won't work when it's plugged in. And then you do the experiment, you plug the coffee maker into the outlet, the coffee maker works. Okay, there's the result. And then, so now you know it wasn't the electrical outlet, so it's probably the toaster. That doesn't work anymore. So that's essentially the same as doing troubleshooting for any kind of component or thing. So in practice, the scientific method is not as rigid and structured as it might at first appear, and it's definitely not. Sometimes an experiment leads to conclusions that favor a change in approach. Often an experiment brings entirely new scientific questions to the puzzle. Many times science does not operate in a linear fashion. Instead, scientists continually draw inferences and make generalizations, finding patterns as their research proceeds. Scientific reasoning is more complex than the scientific method alone suggests. And that is an understatement. Okay, so the final point for this chapter here is talking about basic and applied science. The scientific community has been debating for the last few decades about the value of different types of science. Is it valuable to pursue science for the sake of simply gaining knowledge, or does scientific knowledge only have worth if we can apply it to solving a specific problem or bettering our lives? This question focuses on the differences between two types of science, basic science and applied science. Basic science, or pure science, seeks to expand knowledge regardless of the short-term applications of that knowledge. It is not focused on developing a product or a service of immediate public or commercial value. The immediate goal of basic science is knowledge for knowledge's sake, though this does not mean that in the end it may not result in an application. In contrast, applied science, or technology, it really is in quotes, that's why I said it like that, aims to use science to solve real-world problems, making it possible, for example, to improve a crop yield, find a cure for a particular disease, or save animals threatened by a natural disaster. In applied science, the problem is usually defined for the researcher. Some individuals may perceive applied science as useful and basic science as useless. A question these people might pose to a scientist advocating knowledge acquisition would be, what for? A careful look at the history of science, however, reveals that basic knowledge has resulted in many remarkable applications of great value. Many scientists think that a basic understanding of science is necessary before an application is derived. Therefore, applied science relies on the results generated through basic science. Other scientists think that it is time to move on from basic science and instead to find solutions to actual problems. Both approaches are valid. It is true that there are problems that demand immediate attention. However, few solutions would be found without the help of the knowledge generated through basic science. One example of how basic and applied science can work together to solve practical problems occurred after the discovery of DNA structure led to an understanding of the molecular mechanisms governing DNA replication. Strands of DNA, unique in every human, are found in our cells, where they provide the instructions necessary for life. During DNA replication, new copies of DNA are made shortly before a cell divides to form new cells. Understanding the mechanisms of DNA replication enables scientists to develop laboratory techniques that are now used to identify genetic diseases, pinpoint individuals who were at a crime scene, and determine paternity. Without basic science, it is unlikely that the applied science would exist. Another example of the link between basic and applied research is the Human Genome Project, the logo of which is pictured here. A study in which each human chromosome was analyzed and mapped to determine the precise sequence of DNA subunits and the exact location of each gene. The gene being the basic unit of heredity. An individual's complete collection of genes is his or her genome. Other organisms have also been studied as part of this project to gain a better understanding of human chromosomes. The Human Genome Project relied on basic research carried out with non-human organisms and later with the human genome. An important end goal eventually became using the data for applied research seeking cures for genetically related diseases. While research efforts in both basic science and applied science are usually carefully planned, it is important to note some discoveries are made by serendipity, that is, by means of a fortunate accident or a lucky surprise. Penicillin was discovered when biologist Alexander Fleming accidentally left a petri dish of Staphylococcus bacteria open. An unwanted mold grew, killing the bacteria. The mold turned out to be penicillium, and a new antibiotic was discovered. Even in the highly organized world of science, luck, when combined with an observant, curious mind, can lead to unexpected breakthroughs. Reporting scientific work is a very important link in this chain of science, and sometimes, chain's appropriate. Whether scientific research is basic science or applied science, scientists must share their findings for other researchers to expand and build upon their discoveries. Communication and collaboration within and between subdisciplines of science are key to the advancement of knowledge in science. For this reason, an important aspect of a scientist's work is disseminating results and communicating with peers. Scientists can share results by presenting them at a scientific meeting or conference, but this approach can reach only the limited few who are present. Instead, most scientists present their results in peer-reviewed articles that are published in scientific journals. Peer-reviewed articles are scientific papers that are reviewed, usually anonymously by a scientist's colleagues or peers. These colleagues are qualified individuals, often experts in the same research area, who judge whether or not the scientist's work is suitable for publication. The process of peer review helps to ensure that the research described in a scientific paper or grant proposal is original, significant, logical, and thorough. Grant proposals, which are requests for research funding, are also subject to peer review. Scientists publish their work so that other scientists can reproduce their experiments under similar or different conditions to expand on the findings. The experimental results must be consistent with the findings of other scientists. Now, real-world talk, this is not a perfect process. There are papers that get through that should never have been published, like a certain paper by an Andrew Wakefield in The Lancet. And, there can be good science that gets overlooked. We're not very good at publishing negative results. And in some areas, in some subdisciplines, we're not very good at replication. And that's just the way it is kind of right now. There are many journals and the popular press that do not use a peer review system. A large number of online open access journals with articles available without cost, are now available, many of which use rigorous peer review systems, but some of which do not. Now, those generally we call predatory journals, where they'll publish whatever you send them for a fee, usually $500, $600, $700, and you can have it generated by an algorithm, and they'll still publish it. So if it's not legitimately peer reviewed, it's not a real publication. You might as well self-publish on your WordPress blog or whatever. So results of any studies published in these forums without peer review are not reliable and should not form the basis for other scientific work. In one exception, journals may allow a researcher to cite a personal communication from another researcher about unpublished results with the cited author's permission. And that brings us to the end of this first chapter. Let's see. I think after I've edited this, I'm not going to do the next chapter tonight. I'll probably try to do some of that in the morning before I teach this class. All right. Until next time.